Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where we're going to be talking about RNG in POE. If you are new to the channel, then you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. Today is sort of a preliminary teaser, introductory discussion, appetizer sort of thing. This is not going to be the sum total of all of my thoughts on RNG in Path of Exile. That I'm still working on because there's so much. Today is basically functioning as an appetizer, as a teaser, as an introduction to this discussion, because when I first launched on this project studying RNG in Path of Exile, I thought, well, this will be an interesting discussion. Maybe we can have a video on that. That would be really fun, wouldn't it? And then I started doing a lot more research and a lot more reading, and it just kind of overwhelmed me, and it's too big to handle in just one discussion. So today's just the intro, basically. By the way, if you haven't been around for a while, it's because I haven't been around for a while. Welcome back. It's good to see everybody. I'm hyped for 315, and hopefully 315 will be an exceptional league, one that all of us can remember because we all dropped mirrors during 315. Without any further delays, my goodness, my life has had plenty of those over the last 6 months. Let's jump into the discussion. So I want to start our discussion in RNG by reading you an opinion piece that is not necessarily written by someone who even knows Path of Exile exists, and this is from a completely other industry other than the traditional video gaming industry. This has nothing to do with Path of Exile, at least to my knowledge. And of course, if you want to read this in its entirety on its own, I'll give you the spoiler here in a minute about what industry this is actually about and what this was written about. But if you want to read this entire piece in its totality, you can of course take a look. It's down below in the video description. So without any further ado, it is a fine balance that the designers of, I'm going to put air quotes here and just pretend all of the words that I've blanked out are Path of Exile related. So it is a fine balance that the designers of Path of Exile must maintain to keep players glued to their screens. Reward the user too often and they lose motivation to continue playing. Let them have a lot of fun and they become frustrated and give up altogether. Because of this, modern Path of Exile leagues are made with fine-tuned mathematical margins based on the psychological principles described by B.F. Skinner almost 50 years ago. Skinner was a professor of psychology at Harvard University who investigated human behavior. Okay, I'm going to take a timeout reading about halfway through on this just to say we've talked about Skinner before. We've talked about Skinner boxes before. Lots of people have covered Skinner boxes and action RPGs and just games in general. But if you've never heard of a Skinner box, then hopefully this will introduce you to that concept of a Skinner box and how that psychological concept is then applied into games. Okay, let's continue with the piece. He devised an experiment in which he tested psychological tension and release by putting pigeons in a box with a food container that was controlled by a temperature lever. Skinner designed the food container to sometimes give the pigeons food when they pressed against the lever. The pigeons would press against the lever, but food would not appear every time they did so. This incited expectation and delayed satisfaction in the animal, incentivizing them to press the lever more frequently. Skinner observed that the birds would become agitated and lose interest if the reward came too rarely and if the reward was released too often. The pigeons would not push the mechanism as regularly. That is why the game developers of Path of Exile pour considerable resources into creating the most attractive facades for the player base through leagues, in addition to the fickle reward margins, appealing to human senses to sustain a relationship between the player and Path of Exile. As humans, we match patterns visually and recognize symbols in categories. Path of Exile designers have recognize this and they play on this with random outcomes. When one sees the images on their screen fall into place, players really like that. There is a specific subconscious charge that occurs. This psychological return is bolstered by attractive graphics and engaging interactivity. All right, at this point, you might be wondering, oh, Iron, why on earth would you have us read that? That just seems like the craziest, silliest thing, off topic, random. What does this have to do with Path of Exile? Well, I'm so glad you asked. So that passage that we just read is, of course, from slot designers. It's basically discussing how slots are designed and the various stimuli that go into thinking about and designing how it is that a player is going to maximize their engagement with a slot machine. The article that we read from is called Engineered Seduction: How Slot Machines Keep Users Fixated. Take a look at the deceptive graphic design and psychology behind gambling machines. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring this up, again, this shouldn't be a shock to a lot of us who have played a lot of action RPGs or who have done a lot of research and worked inside video gaming for any length of time, right? There's some serious similarities between casino practices and between gambling practices and between the video gaming industry. The reality is that industries borrow from each other all the time. There's almost always something new to learn from other industries. So this shouldn't shock us. This shouldn't, freak us out. This shouldn't make us, clutch our pearls. Oh my goodness, POE is like grabbing principles from other industries. That shouldn't be the nature of this discussion. The nature of why I bring this up is simply to say there's a lot of common similar themes, overlapping themes, psychologically going on between players in Path of Exile and players who play various gambling sorts of RNG-based games. When you start to think about it, you actually will see a scary amount of parallels between the two. Maybe scary is a poor choice of words there, but a high amount of similarities between the two. It shouldn't necessarily scare us, but it should make us start thinking, that's pretty interesting. At least that's what it's done for me. So I just said, let's start thinking about things between basically gambling, casino style games and Path of Exile. Well, everything in Path of Exile that players interact with that makes a player's experience unique to them is in some way influenced by RNG. Once I read this particular piece, I've read a couple of different pieces, but when I read this particular piece, I read it and I just thought, oh my goodness, if I wasn't reading this explicitly about this other industry and this other game design philosophy going into building something that's attractive for players, if I was just reading this with glasses on that said, hey, this is all about POE, it would very similarly overlap. Everything in Path of Exile that players interact with in some way is influenced by RNG. Now, this isn't rocket science. This isn't a new discovery. Players know this. Chris knows this. Chris Wilson, lead designer of Path of Exile, working at Grinding Gear Games. He's brilliantly articulated this, and we'll watch a little bit of his video in upcoming discussions on RNG in POE to discuss the layers of RNG when Chris made his wonderful speech on designing Path of Exile to be played forever. So this isn't an industry secret. Right? This isn't something that no one's ever figured out before. But putting it into these terms, I personally, had never realized just how far RNG goes in Path of Exile. Let's dive into just a couple of these for instances. So unique items. Unique items are unique. They've got very specific affixes on them that make them unique. Every time you drop a unique wasp's nest, that's what I've got pulled up here, it's going to have those very specific affixes on them. So how are those uniques impacted by RNG? Well, the rolls on every single unique item can get re-rolled, can differentiate itself from one another. And if you're playing in a trade league, then an RNG factor is going to really mess with the outcomes and mess with the value of your particular unique. You might have a poorly or average rolled unique that drops, and it's a 1C item. But have you ever sorted by things that have got perfect rolls, or sorted things by that have got the best rolls on otherwise wide varying uniques, wide varying affixes? You'll actually see that the price goes up significantly for those perfectly rolled uniques. RNG plays a factor even with something as predetermined as uniques. Of course, currency, the entire crafting system of Path of Exile is built on random outcomes. When you use an Exalted Orb in the traditional classic sense of using an Exalted Orb to slam a new stat on an item, there are ways in which you can minimize the impact of RNG in your crafting, and indeed the best crafters in Path of Exile typically know the ways in which to go about efficiently minimizing the potential outcomes of RNG on their particular crafting project. But the reality is RNG still plays a factor. Layers upon layers upon layers. That's That's Chris's language, not mine, but layers of RNG built on top of other layers of RNG. So we've got the itemization system completely built around RNG and RNG impacting that particular item system. The crafting system in Path of Exile is built around RNG and is impacted by RNG as players interact with it. Oh, well, Iron, what about the story? Every time you level up, you level through the same 10x story. Yes, you level up through the same 10x story. It's the same named quests that you go through. It's the same 6 lab trials that you progress through. However, the layout of each and every zone, every single time that you level up, that you experience a new zone, it will in some way be different. Whether that is terrain that can be potentially challenging, whether that's the monsters that you experience, or whether that's simply a direction that you're used to going, left to right, for instance, on a lot of different things while you're progressing through Rayclast. Well, maybe this time it's not left to bottom right. Maybe this time it's left to top right. Maybe sometimes it's towards the middle. Maybe sometimes it's in a general area that you would otherwise have a sense of, but it's actually not there. Your progress is actually in a different spot. RNG impacts even something as solid or something as, locked in stone as the 10x story campaign. Even that has got different layouts and different impacts for RNG. So even the things in Path of Exile that appear to be stable, that appear to be not influenced by RNG, are influenced by RNG. I mentioned monsters a moment ago that you would experience as you would go through maps or go through the 10x story campaign. Even monsters themselves. Yes, there is a subset of monsters that can inhabit each and every zone. There is a subset of various RNG monsters that can be pulled from each zone that they inhabit. But the reality is each magic monster has got its own kind of unique sort of RNG-based affixes that it will have, and that, of course, is going to then be played on, again, with rare monsters. Everything that you interact with, whether it's an item, whether it's a crafting material, whether it's a monster, whether it's a zone, everything in Path of Exile that you as a player experience from the game being designed to you as a player is going to be in some way influenced by RNG. Maybe the things which are the least impacted by RNG is actually interactions with other players, which maybe that's why some of us like trade in Path of Exile, because there is some sort of expected return that you can get as you play a market in Path of Exile. But even that, ultimately, it's still a market. There's still market RNG forces, as it were, at work. So even something as predictable as interacting with somebody on a particular trade deal is still in some way less than set in stone, less than predictable. But it might feel that it's less RNG than a lot of other things going on inside Path of Exile. Even boss fights. There are times when you'll be in a boss fight, and sometimes, as many famous players have posted clips of their rips in hardcore or hardcore solo self-found, have shown, hey, this boss that usually behaves one way has decided to behave a different way in this particular fight. Maybe that's due to rhythm, maybe that's due to timing. But even things as pre-programmed as boss fights can sometimes still be a bit RNG and impact a player's outcome and a player's experience while they're playing Path of Exile in a way that they otherwise didn't expect. So that's my appetizer, that's my thesis, right? Which is simply stating things that many others have stated. Chris Wilson himself has even stated that basically everything in Path of Exile is RNG related. I'm simply trying to push that and say, yep, it's even further than what I had initially thought when I had first heard that from Chris during his speech about just how many layers of RNG there are in Path of Exile. So, questions for you guys today during discussion. Do you agree or disagree that nearly everything in POE is RNG related? And then secondly, is RNG something that you consciously enjoy in Path of Exile? When players are interacting with slot machines or with various gambling devices, they're not necessarily thinking that they're enjoying the RNG. But as the article that we read from today suggested, if players win too frequently, it actually hurts the margins of players coming back and interacting with the particular machine. In other words, there's not enough challenge. If you win too frequently, there's a perceived lack of difficulty, and it's considered child's play, as it were, right? So you want to find that sweet spot for each individual, as it were, when you're designing a game to where there's enough challenge, but to where there's also enough fun and enough victories that they're going to keep playing. If you never give a player an Exalted Orb, then eventually they're hoping for an X and they don't come back. If, however, you just rain down Exalted Orbs upon a player, well, in the long run, that can really hurt player retention because players are expecting that and they don't get it all the time, and then players might not come back. So, as you experience RNG in Path of Exile, do you think it's something that you consciously enjoy? When you hit an Exalted Orb and it goes well, is that something that you enjoy? Would you rather not experience the RNG and simply be able to say, yep, I'd much rather just lock this in and be able to pre-program and plan everything out and guarantee a particular result. Thanks so much for joining us for today's discussion. I'm very much looking forward to our next discussion on this particular topic, where we're going to talk about input RNG and output RNG. Those are two terms that I had never previously heard of, and it is a rabbit hole unto itself, and it's got all sorts of applications inside Path of Exile. So thanks so much for joining us today. I look forward to the next time that we're chatting about RNG and POE, and as always, I hope the upcoming 3.15 league is the league that a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.